Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Scandinavia since 1500, second edition, by Byron J. Nordstrom, narrated by Ulf Bjorklund. Preface. In many ways, this is a very traditional history. I accept the idea that we can talk and write about a conceptual region called Scandinavia, that includes Denmark, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. I believe there is sufficient commonality in the languages, except for Finnish and Sami, cultures and shared pasts in this part of the world, on which to base a history that is not simply manufactured to satisfy some personal or political agenda. One can also, of course, with equal legitimacy, approach each unit within this region as unique and separate. The chronology in which the long modern period from 1500 is subdivided into the Renaissance, early modern, modern, and contemporary, follows a well-established European model. This periodization works reasonably well in terms of political history. It is less useful if other approaches are emphasized, such as social history, for which there might be only two periods, medieval and modern, or women's history, for which one might argue there is one long period extending from the Middle Ages or before down to the 19th century, at which point sufficient changes began to take place to justify demarking a new era. The structure is built around the states or nations of the region, and politics and international relations receive considerable attention. At the same time, I have tried to include economic, social, and cultural developments, to provide some degree of gender balance, to introduce some of the interpretive debates, and to avoid making heroes of individuals or perfect little worlds of the Nordic countries. In terms of explaining why things happen, I prefer a multi-causal approach. Major factors such as geography, resource bases, and climate provides the fundamental environment. Internal and external factors, including individuals, social groups, economic conditions, ideas, technologies, and accidents, are just some of the determiners of events. I am also not a determinist. I believe the history of Scandinavia and of the individual states in the region could have taken very different courses impossible to affirm, but always interesting to contemplate. Scandinavia. Norden. Two proper nouns, and their adjective forms are commonly used as geographic, historical, linguistic, and cultural labels for the region that today includes the countries of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, as well as the Åland Islands and the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Scandinavia and Scandinavian are used most often in the United States. Norden and Nordic are more regularly used in the 5 countries and in Europe. From a number of perspectives, Scandinavia is a more restrictive term. Geographically, Denmark is part of the North German plain. Norway, Sweden, and Finland form parts of the Fennoscandian Shield. The Åland Islands are part of a Baltic archipelago between Finland and Sweden. The Faroes are composed of 18 major and many smaller islands formed through volcanic activity. Iceland lies at an intersection of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the Greenland-Iceland-Faroe Ridge, and is still being shaped by volcanoes. Greenland, the world's largest island, is a result of the continental drift. Linguistically, Danish, Faroese, Icelandic, Norwegian, and Swedish are North Germanic languages. Finnish and Sami evolved from a common Finno-Ugric base they share with Estonian and Hungarian. Kalaallisut, or West Greenlandic, is the language of the island's indigenous people. The word Scandinavia likely comes from the Proto-Germanic Scandinavia or Skandinavia, and may refer to far southern Germany or today's province of Skåne. The word may have been Latinized by Pliny the Elder to Scandinavia in his Naturalis Historia, circa 77 CE. The first N may have been inserted as a copying error that stuck. Norden derives from words with similar spellings meaning north, and the use of this term to denote a specific geographic area, the north, appears regularly from the 18th century. In the chapters that follow, Scandinavia, Norden, and their adjective forms will be used often as interchangeable equals, except in instances where the context may dictate a preference. Also in Chapter 14, Norden and Nordic are used almost exclusively. I have tried to address several themes, many of which are not unique to Scandinavian history, at various points throughout this text. One is the frequency with which historical accounts of events or personalities become canon, fundamental and unquestionable pieces of a personal, cultural, or national identity. For example, uncritical assessments of individuals such as Gustav II Adolf, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, Christian IV of Denmark, or Christian Frederik, the Danish prince who played a central role in the attempts to establish Norway's independence in 1814, have been incorporated into the national historical mythologies of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, respectively. Establishing the truth of their roles and importance has often been difficult. Similar problems exist in the treatment of topics such as the resistance movements in World War II and the Scandinavian welfare states. Conversely, there is a problem of what has been played down or ignored in many histories. Although the Nordic countries are today among the most affluent, just, humane, and democratic in the world, there are dark sides to both their histories and contemporary conditions. For example, early modern governments and nobilities exploited the lower classes. Women were long regarded as non-persons, often denigrated and abused. The region has its share of witch hunts. Legal punishments were cruel and inhumane. Denmark and Sweden participated in the slave trade. Alcoholism has long been a serious social problem. A few got very rich during World War I from profiteering. Swedish church and government officials knew about the Holocaust long before they did anything about it. And violent crime, racism, and drug abuse are Nordic problems in the early 21st century. From an ethical perspective, there are numerous cases in Nordic history when expediency was more important than doing the right thing. Other themes are the importance of external factors in the shaping of Scandinavian history, the importance of internal factors in that history, and the interaction between external and internal factors. It is not difficult to catalogue what has come to Norden from abroad. A list must include religions, Christianity, Lutheranism, a long list of Protestant denominations, and, in the early 21st century, virtually all of the world's religions. Political ideas and ideologies, absolutism, liberalism, socialism. Economic ideas and practices, commercial capitalism, mercantilism, industrial capitalism, state capitalism. Intellectual movements, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, Romanticism. Technologies, weapons, ship designs, iron and steel making methods, energy sources and exploitation techniques. Fashions, tastes, art styles, and literary genre. Nor is it difficult to identify the carriers of these influences. Scandinavia has been a receiver of immigrants throughout its history, and whole chapters could, for example, be written on the roles of Dutch, English, French, German, Russian, Jewish, Balkan, African, Middle Eastern, and Southeast Asian peoples coming to the region. Merchants, entrepreneurs, artisans, religious reformers, government officials, mercenaries, intellectuals, and asylum seekers from outside the region are just some of the categories of in-migrants that have brought and continue to bring influences into the region. At the same time, travelers, students, and astute seekers of the new and the useful from Scandinavia brought back much that affected the area's history. It is easy, however, to overemphasize the foreign influences at the expense of seeing the unique ways in which the peoples of Norden adapted what was imported. Immigrants were absorbed into the societies. Ideas, techniques, technologies, and the like were modified. Nordic individuals and groups contributed to new developments and to the integration of the imports. Gustav II Adolf's military reforms, Danish absolutism, the constitutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, Ibsen and Strindberg's plays, Scandinavian modern design, management techniques, and shop floor production strategies, and the welfare states are just a few examples of aspects of Nordic history that are amalgams of the external, internal, and genuine originality. 1. Scandinavia before the modern era. This introductory chapter intends to provide a thematic overview of Scandinavian history from the earliest evidence of human settlement down to about 1500, and to supply the listener with some background and sense of context before beginning the more thorough examination of the modern period. The record of human activity in Scandinavia spans about 11,000 years. By far the greatest share of this, about 10,000 years, from the earliest evidence of human presence through the Viking Age, belongs to prehistory, to the past at its most obscure. Evidence for these times is fragmentary, scattered, and often subject to conflicting interpretations. Entire societies and the nature of human lives are defined by archaeologists, analyzing a rich but still limited and silent base of prehistoric remains, including tools, household articles, building foundations, and human and animal skeletal remains, generally found in settlements, burial, and sacrificial places. Some of these sites have revealed quite spectacular items, objects made of precious materials, whose workmanship demonstrates the remarkable skills of prehistoric artisans. The oldest written accounts about Scandinavia appear in Naturalis Historia by the Roman scholar Pliny the Elder, 23 to 79 CE. But these are vague and based on uncertain secondary sources. In general, the Roman and early medieval periods are largely silent, and it is only with the 9th century and the increase in contacts between Norse peoples and others, both outside and inside Scandinavia, that more references to the area appear in written sources. Among these are the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, the Muslim Ahmad ibn Fadlan's travel accounts, Risala, and early church literature, such as Rambert's Vita Ansgari, Life of St. Ansgar, and Adam of Bremen's history of the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen. The earliest written sources from within Scandinavia, which date to the pre-Viking and Viking periods, are inscriptions and runic characters, an alphabet of 24, later 16 rectilinear letters adapted from the Roman. Most often these sources were brief descriptions of the deeds of an individual or an event carved in stone, but a few surviving wood pieces from late in the period indicate the runic alphabet was used to keep account records as well. In either case, these inscriptions make for a thin history indeed. The first histories written in Scandinavia come only after the conversion to Christianity. These include Aelnot's Chronicle, Aelnot's Chronicle, from around 1120, and from the early 13th century, Saxo Grammaticus' 16-volume Gesta Danorum, Deeds of the Danes, and Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, a saga history of Norse kings. It is only since that time that there have been both written histories and written sources about Scandinavia from Scandinavia. The oldest archaeological evidence of human presence in the Nordic region dates to before the last glaciation and includes a controversial find from a cave in Kristinestad, Finland, which points to a Neanderthal occupation of the site over 100,000 years old. However, the last glaciers and the changes in land masses and sea levels have erased most remains. As a result, the study of Nordic prehistory deals primarily with the peoples who lived in the area beginning about 14,000 years ago. The earliest humans in this period migrated in, probably from both the south and the north. This in-migration occurred as the Scandinavian ice sheet, which had completely covered the area and at one time may have been as much as 3,000 meters thick in places, slowly melted and laid bare a gradually expanding area of Arctic and subarctic tundra. During a period spanning almost 20,000 years, the geographic outline of contemporary Scandinavia took shape. This process was determined by the glaciers and the waters produced by their melting, the slow rebounding of the land as the weight of the glaciers was removed, the changing ocean levels, and significant climatic variations. The Scandinavia that first emerged would be entirely unrecognizable compared with that of today. It was composed of a thin belt of land along the coasts of what is today western and northern Norway, a piece of northern Finland connected with Russia, and an extension of the North German plain that reached into south-central Sweden and westward to the British Isles. Around 8000 BCE, the huge freshwater lake formed by the glacial melting on the east side of the region broke through to the North Sea and became a saltwater bay. Half a millennium later, this state was reversed and a new freshwater lake developed, only to be reversed again as erosion and sea level changes slowly made the lake into the Baltic Sea. By 2000 BCE, a geography recognizable as today's Scandinavia had evolved. During this same period, the region also underwent profound climatic changes. Subarctic at first, the climate gradually grew more temperate, and Norden enjoyed an era when it was warmer than it is today, from about 5000 to 700 BCE. Taken together, the geological and climatic changes determined the animal and plant life patterns of the region, as well as the topography. All of this, in turn, shaped the nature of the human cultures that developed there. Some of the oldest evidence of modern humans in Scandinavia, including bone and flint-edged tools, discovered at Gjeldsøvelse, Slotseng, and Sølvbjerg in present-day Denmark, dates to about 13,000 BCE, and belongs to the so-called Hamburg culture, a nomadic group dependent on reindeer hunting whose reach extended into far southern Sweden. Younger evidence from around 8000 BCE has been found at Ski and Store Myrvatn in Norway. There remains a running debate about the presence of Neanderthal groups in Scandinavia. Over the ensuing several thousand years, people slowly spread into Sweden and the coastal regions of Norway. The range of human habitation was surprisingly wide, as evidenced by discoveries reaching from Galta in southwest Norway to Sarnes in the far north. In general, the archaeological record indicates the presence of nomadic hunting-gathering fishing cultures across Norden that were entirely dependent on and shaped by variations in the natural environment. The climate, animals, and vegetation determined their lifestyles and diets, as well as their material and spiritual cultures. They made tools of bone, wood, stone, and flint. Amber and flint appear to have been used in religious activities. Most often, they made clothing from hides, which they may also have used in housing, along with wood and grass. The Stone Age archaeological record paints a surprisingly complex picture. The living and geological resources of differing regions produced specializations, such as coastal fishing and inland game hunting groups. Tool materials varied by area, and tool-making abilities became strikingly sophisticated. An extensive trade in flint developed and reached far into northern Sweden, as evidenced by finds at Bjurskjelet on the coast of Västerbotten. Artifacts of bone or amber, as well as petroglyphs and pictographs, such as those at Alta in Norway and the somewhat later ones at Nemforsen in northern Sweden, depict reindeer, moose, bears, birds, fish, whales, and humans. These depictions indicate the presence of animist religious beliefs from very ancient times. The break between the Old and New, or Peasant, Stone Ages falls sometime around 4200 BCE and is defined by several important transitions that first occurred in the southern areas of Scandinavia, then gradually spread northward into central Sweden and eastern Norway, and finally reached up the Norwegian west coast. Among these are the development of fired pottery, systematic deforestation and cultivation of crops, domestication of animals, increased permanence of settlement sites, and growing cultural and trade contacts with other parts of what we now call Europe. All of these are evidenced in the increasingly varied and often monumental archaeological finds from southern Scandinavia, such as those at Sarup on the Danish island of Fyn, or Berkar in Jutland. The Neolithic also appears to have brought new religious beliefs and practices in parts of the region, particularly with regard to death and an afterlife. Hundreds of megalithic graves, including dolmens and passage or chamber graves, survive, principally in Denmark, but also into southern Sweden, dating to between 3300 and 2000 BCE. The style may have had its origins in northwestern France and spread across Europe and the British Isles and into Norden. These monumental graves were made of large vertically placed stones covered by a capstone and then covered with turf. The dolmens are smaller than what are generally regarded as the later styles, and they appear to have usually been used as individual graves. The more complicated passage graves, such as those at Falbygden, Sweden, are elaborate structures whose chambers appear to have been used by successive generations as burial sites, in which the earlier remains were either removed or brushed aside. Two things are particularly important about these graves. First, Their constructions must have required the efforts of many people, which suggests some kind of social or religious hierarchy. Second, although we know nothing about the actual practices and ideas connected to the graves, their presence and long-term use certainly points to the existence of strongly held and long-lasting beliefs and burial customs. Around 3000 BCE, Scandinavia was invaded by a new group, variously called the corded ware, boat axe, battle axe, or single grave people, named for their pottery style, beautifully crafted stone weapons, or simple graves. They probably were Indo-European pastoralists, now called Yamnaya, from the Eurasian steppe, and they spread across much of Europe and likely established cultural dominance over the earlier peoples of southern and central Scandinavia. Although opinions differ about their importance, one of their legacies in Scandinavia appears to have been the tall, long-skulled physical type so often cited as characteristic of the region. In addition, their simple graves, normally containing the remains of the dead person facing east and one or more weapons, replace the passage graves, supporting the contention that they brought a new religion. Finally, through their contacts with other groups farther south, they appear to have contributed to a significant increase in trade and cultural interaction between late Neolithic Scandinavia and the European continent. One of the richest periods in the early prehistory of Norden, at least for the southern areas of the region, was the Bronze Age. During this era, Norden was geologically and topographically very similar to today, but its climate was warmer and more comfortable. Although most people probably had an easier time basing their lives on simple farming, hunting, fishing, and gathering, it is clear that early in the period, a chieftain trader class, whose roots may have extended back to those earlier in-migrants, enjoyed both prominence and affluence based on herding, exploitation of local resources, and control of trade with areas as far off as the Middle East. Rich in amber, furs, honey, and wax, and probably enslaving other people, an elite in southern Bronze Age Scandinavia appears to have exchanged these goods for copper, tin, bronze, and gold. Three important types of archaeological finds bear witness to this: the petroglyphs, Helldristningar, of southern Sweden and Norway, the grave goods from several large burial mounds, and an array of remarkable offering finds from what appear to have been sacrificial sites. Bronze Age petroglyphs are found primarily in southern and central Sweden and in southeastern Norway, generally on low-lying outcroppings of stone and on the stones of burial chambers. Among the most striking are those at Tanum in Sweden. Although they show some local variations, they are thematically similar in their simple outline images of hunters, farmers, herdsmen, oarsmen, women, domestic and wild animals, boats, wheels, weapons, suns, footprints, and geometric shapes. They are believed to represent the common activities of a complex socially stratified society in which hunting, farming, trade, and warfare were important. They also suggest that religion was based on either a panoply of gods or a single sun god who looked after the essential aspects of life. These dual interpretations indicate the difficulty of determining the real meaning of many sources from these periods. Burial mounds were common to much of the Bronze Age, and today there remains hundreds scattered throughout Denmark, southern Sweden, and southeastern Norway. Most are located at prominent spots in the landscape, and were probably meant to be seen from the sea or other waterway. A few are of monumental scale, including the one at Ektved in southern Jutland, and another near Uppsala in Sweden. The Ektved mound is estimated to have been about 90 feet in diameter and 13 feet high. This structure, whose construction was complex and involved the labor of untold many, was a grave for a young woman buried in the summer of 1370 BCE. At its core was a well-preserved oak casket that contained an animal hide robe, a young woman's remains and clothing, a woolen rug, several small containers with everyday articles, and the remains of a child. The clothing was especially interesting. The body was buried in a revealingly short braided wool skirt and woven woolen top. Experts suggest that this costume was intended to announce the girl's maturity and to attract young men. This clothing also tells us much about the textile skills of the people of this period. Clearly spinning, dyeing, and weaving were parts of this culture, perhaps as aspects of women's work. The Håga Mound, west of Uppsala, several hundred years more recent, measured about 150 feet in diameter and was between 18 and 20 feet tall. It contained a cremation burial, and excavations have yielded a magnificent bronze sword and gilt brooch. In addition to the mounds, the people of Bronze Age Norden also constructed ship settings. These stone monuments were arranged in the shape of a vessel and usually placed close to a waterway. They appear to have been used as burial sites or to commemorate people who had died elsewhere, and they reinforce the argument that travel and trade were important aspects of the era. The individual artifact record of the Bronze Age is also striking. In part, it is made up of weapons, swords, daggers, and spearheads, some of which are elaborately decorated. In addition, there is a wealth of gold and bronze jewelry, including circular belt plates, bracelets, and armbands. There are also lures, beautifully curved musical instruments, some of which are still playable. One particularly striking artifact is the Trundholm Sun Chariot, a small wheeled bronze cart carrying a golden sun disk and drawn by a cast bronze horse, which gives added credence to the argument that the sun was the center of Bronze Age religion for a time. Like many other important pieces from this period, the wagon was probably left as an offering in what was then a small body of water and is now a bog. The richness of the Bronze Age, as well as the richness of the archaeological record, ended around 700 to 500 BCE. The climate turned colder and wetter. The growing season shortened, and livestock had to be sheltered in the winter. Trade was interrupted, in part because of the dominance of Celtic tribes, whose influence reached from Central Europe to the British Isles. At the same time, iron replaced bronze. Although at first an imported material, iron was found in Scandinavia as small unrefined nodules in bogs or marshes, and processed in simple kilns. Overall, life in southern Scandinavia appears to have become poorer, harsher, and more violent in the Iron Age, and the simple cremation graves from the period are seen as evidence of these trends. In the northern reaches, the semi-nomadic hunting and the more settled coastal cultures continued to develop, largely independently and virtually with their own chronologies. The spread of the Roman Empire, which ended the dominance of the Celts, brought renewed trade and new cultural influences to Scandinavia. Archaeological finds throughout southern Scandinavia contains evidence of contact, including glassware from the Rhine, metalwork such as the silver Hobie cups found in Denmark, with their depictions of scenes from the Iliad, and thousands of Roman coins, many of which were turned into items of jewelry. Many of these items were deposited in graves, as objects probably intended to accompany the deceased on the journey into the afterlife. There is also an amazing group of human remains unearthed, usually quite by chance, in Denmark that date from the early years of the new millennium. These remains are of the so-called bog people and include Tolland man, discovered in a bog in central Jutland in 1950. This corpse, along with others, is almost perfectly preserved, tanned in the special chemistry of the evolving peat bog in which it was found. Hair, skin, skeleton, stomach contents, and facial expression have survived. These finds might reveal the presence of a religion devoted to fertility, in which humans were sacrificed in order to ensure an abundant harvest. This is hardly surprising, given the environment and the central importance of crop farming and animal husbandry to the people of this area. Collectively, Iron Age finds point to a time in southern Scandinavia when farming was the occupation of the many, and trade in luxury items was the domain of the few. It is also clear that small numbers of people were specialists in metallurgy and produced elaborately decorated weapons, as well as personal objects of silver, gold, and bronze. The discovery of buried treasure hoards, as well as refuge forts and fortified villages, indicates that violence was also very much part of life in this period. The Baltic islands of Öland and Gotland became important trade centers. Low-lying, with few natural barriers, these islands were open to attacks. Consequently, more than 90 fortified sites were constructed, including Eketorp on Öland and Torsbergen on Gotland. Beginning in the late 4th century, The peoples of what we now call Europe became involved in one of history's great migration phases.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?